it's
The Wairua, it's wide, isn't it?
Who are we handing over to here?
very fair question on the board here. What about the Ngāruru?
Yeah.
What about it?
Well, there are groundwater abstraction effects on the Ngārura River, and as Jeff mentioned before, the flow enhancement, if that was the same mechanism, would be prohibitively expensive and also have much greater adverse effect on groundwater levels. So we've come up with a different solution that we have modelled.
Slides before I see you want me to go through it.
Yeah.
Oh, you know, that's,
I think that's a photo of
yeah, so this is the slide I showed earlier that shows the effect of groundwater pumping on the Ngāruru River. So in that 2012-13 really dry period, the Ngāruru at Fernhill, where we do our monitoring, there was up to 770 litres a second, around about, stream depletion caused by groundwater pumping. And we looked at the different options there, as I said before, the same things about reducing allocation or introducing bans to the groundwater takes. We explored those before, and as I said, they weren't found to be viable options. So we looked at the other options of managed aquifer recharge again, stream augmentation from groundwater, which just wouldn't be feasible due to the volume of water that's required. So we also looked at river augmentation, which is that that circle text box on the left-hand side there, and it was found to be feasible. So the policy 38 is commits us to investigate the remedying of those stream depletion effects in consultation with tangata whenua and the wider community through investigating the all of those economic, technical and environmental feasibility issues and cultural. Should be in there.
Should definitely be in there.
Yeah.
Oh, so how's this different from the Ruataniwha?
not.
I guess it's different from Ruataniwha because it's a much smaller out-of-stream storage. It's like 5 million cubic metres we'll see soon. It's not this big, massive 90 million cubic metre thing sitting in a tributary. It's out-of-stream storage. And if the feasibility shows it's viable, then this commits us to develop options for funding and construction and operation of such a scheme through a targeted rate. And if it's shown not to be viable, then we've got to find an alternative method. So this report was commissioned as part of the tank work. It's a consultant who was working with us on the source or surface water modelling that was integrated with the groundwater modelling on looking at the feasibility of the Te Tua storage scheme, and found that the effects of groundwater pumping technically definitely could be offset during that dry summer of 2012-13 with 4.5 million cubic metres of live storage. So it's not a massive storage facility, with a high flow allocation of a fairly modest 0.8 of a cubic metre. So remember we talked last week about a high flow allocation potentially being 8 cumecs, so that's 10% of that. And based on the current minimum flow of 2,400 litres a second, it also found it could be feasible for higher minimum flows, but it gets more onerous as those minimum flows go higher. So that's where we got to with the Ngāruru. I'll just point out, Tania, you might have, if you've got a printout, there'll be a whole bunch of slides after that that are irrelevant. They shouldn't have been there, sorry, in your printout.
Oh, is this the groundwater flow modelling?
Yeah, sorry, it was really early in the morning when I finished this and they should have been deleted.
It's hard to get more than we get.
Whole community
Sorry?
geared up for that.
Hard to get more than we get.
Yes,
Because she's in the sun. 4.5.
And this council scrub the hands of everyone down there.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? So 4.5 million solves our entire problem if we use it entirely for augmentation.
for offsetting the effects of groundwater pumping on the Ngāruru.
Yeah. So Peter, what are your thoughts on that?
Aotearoa.
Yeah, a dam, that's a small dam.
Well, the dam is it privately owned or publicly owned?
Yeah.
Let's say it's
That's a-
publicly owned. Let's say it's publicly
Have to
operated.
be. And then if you're going to store it, going to have fish in it?
Yeah.
You're going to have wildlife in it? Is the water going to get polluted? And is it going to come back into the Ngarudooro higher than the recharge or below it? That's really the two problems.
Yeah, and I think that's why the policy doesn't prescribe the scheme. It enables it and requires feasibility studies to consider all those things.
But surely the proposal has been about the dam in the past has been quite a way up the Ngaruroa as one of the tributaries, and generally above where most of the water goes into the aquifer. So it would be just like making sure that the Ngaruroa, when it comes down to where it is underground, the aquifer would be fuller than what it would be otherwise.
Yeah, whanga. There's a spot there.
Yep.
So there's nothing stopping that being used as an option or considered?
Please.
Is it just a matter of circumstance that the 5 million cubes that you're talking about here is the same as the 5 million cubes you're talking about for augmentation for the other streams?
Well,
The
it is coincidental, but the reason that we looked at 5 million cubic metres here is because the Tatua storage is currently 500,000 litres, 500,000. And Mike Glazebrook came to the tank group and said, look, there's potential. I've had engineering surveys and engineering assessments done on this to easily put in a dam in Mike's words. It's relatively easy, and we could raise it to 5 million cubic metres. So
He just lifts it because he's got a big valley behind. So
and he
just lifts
said,
it.
why don't you play around with that as an option? So in a sense, it's hypothetical. It might end up being viable, but it's just a hypothetical storage. In this case, you could potentially get away with a smaller storage with a higher allocation, for instance.
No, my question was, it just happens to be that we're talking about 5 in this two whatever it is scheme is 5 million cubes, and prior to Smoko we were talking about
5 million cubic metres.
5 million cubic
Yeah.
metres. Just okay, that's cool.
Yeah,
So he was wondering, is this coincidence or is it planned?
yeah, it's coincidence.
Okay, that's all right.
If you wanted to do both, fingers crossed, from a single storage unit, you'd have to have 10.
Yeah. But you already got one.
Yeah.
Is the allocation of 20% for tangata whenua targeted to come out of there?
Yeah, they would.
Not necessarily, no, because this is a mitigation measure for offsetting or mitigating the stream depletion effects from the groundwater takes, and the high flow allocation is a separate allocation for any other end users, and that's where the 20% is for the,
And the high flow,
yeah,
which would, I thought that was used to be stored, the high flow.
yeah.
So
I would have thought.
when you say not necessarily, my question was, is a 20% allocation for mana whenua in the store?
Is it real or not?
Is it real or not?
Not this scheme, because this scheme is aimed at offsetting the impact of the stream depletion from groundwater takes.
As currently proposed.
As current.
Yeah.
But we would only, Jenny's point is, we would only have one. We wouldn't have 2 or 3, would we? So, yeah.
So where is the 20%
Yeah, where
ever
would
going
it
to
come
come
from?
from? Is it real, or is this just a? I'm going
Paper.
to go there. Is it just a softener?
The softener.
Okay.
Is it a paper exercise?
It's future storage. I think the fact that you've made limits, allocation limits, and you've also acknowledged over-allocation in some of the surface water bodies, and according to the allocation limits, there will be a lot more interest in further storage. It's a fact of putting limits in place. There is going to be further demand.
So in effect, there has been no thinking currently of where that 20% allocation of water would come from.
No, it's being provided for with the next augmentation scheme potentially, or a separate standalone one that we haven't really thought about how it would be delivered.
So I think if mana whenua wanted to build a dam for storage, it would need to have, obviously you wouldn't do that unless you had access to water to fill the thing. And so that's where the allocation sits, and so effectively it is carved out from the allocation, the high flow allocation, the winter water allocation. It's carved out there for Tangata Whenua if it wants to, if they want to build a dam, or if they want to partner with someone else to build a dam. Now, acknowledge up front, it is very, it's quite, it was a decision of the Tank Group. It is challenging policy. It is, wouldn't necessarily be that, it would have to be very carefully crafted to give effect to that intention. And I think this is, I think Tanya, when we had the workshop, absolutely, raised those concerns around, well, how real is it? And I suppose there are no guarantees because it is quite innovative policy, and it in some respects gets ahead of some of the rights and interest debates that are happening around the country. So it was an attempt from the Tank Group to address the equity issue that was discussed before, and completely up to you to decide how well it's addressed it. But I can assure you it wasn't intended. If I spoke on behalf of the Tank Group, it wasn't a here it is. Let's just chuck this in. This will make someone happy.
I think it's a gesture. It's nice, but it's actually
very difficult to
30% of nothing, and it's quite out there in terms of reality. I mean, it might happen, it might not.
I actually don't agree that it's 20% of nothing because, we've been discussing all day today about how the groundwater is fully allocated, and there is only one source of extra water, and that's water that is harvested at high flow periods from the Nararora River, or maybe the Turakuri as well. So my question, Jeff, and you may not know the answer to this off the top of your head, at the recommended rate of capture that has come through in the recommendations from staff to us, have you done any modelling on flows in the Nararora that indicate how many million cubic metres of water might actually be available if we had the storage capacity to capture it?
17, isn't it?
Yeah, that's where we were getting. Actually, it's in the next presentation, but which builds on from where we were last week when there were a lot of questions and issues raised. So we used that hypothetical storage of 17.5 million cubic metres that could be filled with the high flow allocation of 8 or an extra 6 cubics. Yeah.
So the total capturable amount might be 17. You're saying that we would need 4.5 to 5 to do the Nararora augmentation, yep, which leaves in the order of 12 or 13, 12 million cubic metres. And what you're saying is 20% of the 17 could be allocated to Tangata Whenua, which would be 3 to 4 million. So there'd still be some other water left.
Yeah.
So yep. So can you refer me to the policy number or the policy in the plan where it says that it's intended to leave 20% aside? 47. 47.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yep.
So it's in there.
Tank Group put it in there.
Can we just have some clarification on that?
Yes,
please.
Clarification on what?
Well, can I just ask, in clarifying that, because it just dawned on me what that means. So in the tank recommendation is that of that 17 million cubes that is essentially available, there is reserved for Tangata Whenua the opportunity to store 20%, which is 3 to 4 million cube as of right. So that's available as of right. If they chose to have, if a group chose to have a storage option somewhere, they would automatically have access to 20% of that water. Is that the recommendation from Tank?
That's the recommendation from Tank.
So it's a significant concession holding for that application.
I think what's been expressed around the table and was expressed last week, it was a gesture from Tank. How it's received by Tangata Whenua is
It's on the table.
It's on the table, and it's challenging policy in terms of the RMA.
But the difference is, though, here, what's been asked by Jenny, is that if the regional council goes and builds a dam, a holding dam on the tributary of the Ngāruaru, which has 5 million cubic metres in it. So her question was, do Tangata Whenua get 20% of that 5 million cubic metres? And the question here would be how it was to be funded. So if it was to be funded by a rate, which was levied across all, people who were in the consent holders, then how would the regional council charge the consent holders for the 5 million cubic metres and then allocate 20% of that to Tangata Whenua to do with what they like free? I don't think it could do.
Well, so in terms of funding it via a targeted rate, there may be issues under the Local Government Rating Act in terms of beneficiary, etc. So it may be more a use of the council's investment capital that would be applied to this purpose, although noting that it may not. It might, in the scheme of the whole project, yield a return on capital, but then again, it might not. The government is currently developing a policy under the Provincial Growth Fund for irrigation schemes, and they've made public comment to the effect that they intend providing central government funding to storage schemes that provide for a preferential allocation to Tangata Whenua. That was something that David Parker put on the table to iwi leaders in the context of the government's ongoing discussions around rights and interests. Although that policy remains incomplete, it's got to get through Cabinet, it's got to get past New Zealand First. There's obviously division within government about rights and interest question, and there is also some degree of standoff between the government and iwi leaders right now over rights and interests more broadly. So there is some light in this in terms of how it might be funded, but there's obviously a lot of complications. And as Tom said, this is challenging from an RMA point of view. So whatever policy is decided here is going yet through a Schedule 1 planning process and likely to be the Environment Court as well. So the legal basis for this will get a jolly good thrashing yet.
But what I heard from, this is my apprehension from the tank recommendation, was that if there's extra water available, 17 million sort of thing, then 20% of that is available to Tangata Whenua like that. That's
off the top.
Off the top. Off the top. And it just left me the impression was the 20% we've heard before about the fishing. Yeah, so much fish, 20% is for Tangata Whenua. But they have to go and get their own boat and catch the 20%. You with me? So this is what you have to do. It's not, you don't take 20% of the fish that's landed, you have to go and get it. So I would have thought this is a similar thing. There's the money, the water is there. Tangata Whenua have the 20%. How they then have to be responsible capturing it, transmitting, doing what they want to do with it. But that's for them to go and do.
To which I would, the only thing I'll say to that is that as a past pleasure boat owner, sometimes there's more boats than crew, and we don't know, but if down the track, I mean, obviously a high flow allocation in the Heretoga Plains would be quite sought after, and so if someone wanted to build a significant dam and they wanted access to water, then they're obviously going to be looking for people who have allocation to water. So we absolutely have no idea which way it would go, but I would imagine there would be quite a strong opportunity for Tangata Whenua to join with a scheme. But I'm not saying that it will happen or will be required to happen, or like I say, as James said, and I think the government policy post-dated the inclusion of this in tank. So this actually was ahead of where the government was. So look, it's absolutely there's no guarantees here about.
I just want you to get I want to be so we're clear about what's being proposed here.
Yeah, because I wasn't clear before.
This is not a commitment from HBRC to fund infrastructure to capture that 20%.
Sorry, what?
It's not a commitment.
That's exactly. That's what I want to clear. That's what Jenny was asking the question about.
To allocate it.
Yes, that's right.
Well, it's fair to say that there was nothing remotely like a robust discussion of how this 20% might occur. and be funded in the tank process. This was a 5-minute discussion. Yep. Right? 5-minute discussion, but unanimously approved for a 5-minute discussion. But I would, from other aspects of the discussion around water harvesting, water storage, and so forth, my read of the group was that the general presumption all along was that people interested in harvesting water would need to pay for it. It wasn't going to be public money. It was going to be user money. That was the general drift of the sentiment around water harvesting in general.
Just following on from that, Tom, just on this topic of who pays for what, in relation to the proposed augmentation schemes, which will benefit irrigators because they won't need to turn off their pumps, are those costs of augmentation anticipated to be paid for by consent holders?
Yes.
Exclusively.
They currently are in Twyford.
Yeah.
They currently are in Twyford. They funded the CapEx and they fund the operation costs.
And is that clear in this draft plan change?
Hopefully it is. It's both directed by policy and reflected in the rules that require contributions to schemes. And this is actually the more challenging policy than the high flow allocation one, but we need to make sure that we have the framework in place that requires the assessment of the effect to be done so that we can work out individuals' contributions and that we then impose the cost through a condition on a consent. And we're proposing that we can work through that on the annual schedule of fees and charges. We can establish those through the fees and charges. So that's how that would be paid for.
Okay. So we'd be charged.
And so does that also flow on in terms of future water take allocations, that having paid these fees or contributed capital to enable this augmentation, that's counted as investment by those users, and when they come up for consent, resource consent again, that they, then get that advantage of being able to say, well, actually, I've already invested in this, and therefore you have to take that into account when you look at whether to reallocate the water take to them. The concern I've got is that are we entrenching a use of water through augmentation that will then make it difficult to claw back?
I don't think so. We have policy that says this is something we're going to try in terms of mitigating the adverse stream depletion effects, and we are committed to reviewing the success of that or otherwise in 10 years. So it's got to be done at a plan level, not at a consent stage. So the plan will change the provisions for the consent holders if necessary.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Marianne, existing use rights don't give you a right just to carry on with what you've always done. It's just the extent to which you can modify those allocations. So it's not a stick in the stand forever.
No, that's right.
But it must be taken into account. It's another factor in favour of existing use.
That's right.
Yeah.
Sorry. Where you go, Tanya? You got another question?
I wanted to bring us back to policy 38, which we started out on, which was talking about the potential damming of the Ngurururu. But if you've got a question in between that relates to what we were just talking about, maybe better if you go first.
Thanks, Tanya. So there's 17 million cubic metres available from high flow to allocate from high flow potentially, right? Just at a guess. We need 5 million cubes for augmentation. What's the consented take from high flow already? The total?
0.
There is high flow allocation.
Glazebrook.
Yeah, in this next presentation, it's 1224 litres a second.
Which works out to how many cubes?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, that 17.5 million is kind of arbitrary. It's an arbitrary storage that was said to be able to irrigate 3,500 hectares. Now, the volume of water that comes down a river every year above those minimum flows for high flow allocation will be more than that.
Oh, vastly.
I can't believe you get 17 mils. I mean, if you lived in Hawke's Bay in the last 12 days, and the vast amount of water that's gone charging in, I've got some photos of the Kanamu, I just can't believe it's 17 million cubes.
Yeah, there's far more water than that comes
Vastly
down the
more.
river, but the reason we use 17.5
And from
million
God, from the sky.
is because we had restrictions on the maximum flow where you could extract to take it to storage because you don't want it full of sediment and logs and things. So there's far more water that comes down the river than that, and you may or may not be able to use it. So it's difficult to put a volume on it.
What I'm trying to drive at there is because there is very little allocation at the moment, there is only expected to be 5 million cubes for augmentation. Why was the number of 20% settled on and not something like 50% for allocation for tangata whenua? In a five minute,
I think three numbers were thrown in the air, and what came down was 20.
Okay.
It's 20 as well, as used before. It's on fisheries, it's on aquaculture, it's a whole pile of things been used in.
I think it's fair to say we haven't done a detailed legal analysis of the survivability of this policy through the process. So it's going to be very much out there in terms of any precedents. I suspect there'll be a degree of national interest in this policy as it winds its way through. And I just want to be really clear with the committee that whether we like it or not, there is no legal basis under the Resource Management Act for us to allocate water to users that do not have proximal land and...
I beg to differ. Sorry.
All right, well, there we are. Let's have it out.
There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
On the forecourt.
Because the council can allocate water to different activities.
Yes.
It can choose. And so that's why we can't allocate to individuals, but we can. And so that's why the policy is phrased around the activity of improving Māori cultural, economic, social well-being. So that's the activity for which the water is being reserved.
Sorry, in terms of the consenting part of that,
So what we haven't developed further is how that 20% gets taken up. So it's not, we haven't adjusted
From
any of the
where?
rules. It's from the high flow allocation, that 8 cubic metres per second.
Yeah, but,
So
you know...
there are options to be looked at in terms of, does the next person who wants to apply for a consent to store water, are they required to have 20% available? Or does the council just keep allocating water until 20% is left? And then it's up to iwi to find a solution for that. I would suggest...
but we couldn't allocate out of this, the total groundwater resource, say 20% into a pool, if you like, for a non-specific activity and
Well, this is
consent.
Well, this is where the usefulness of iwi management plans is going to be proved in terms of how do we know the allocation is for Māori economic development, social, economic and cultural development, without having some criteria and some rules around how to make that decision.
So it's
that's
worth having a look at, isn't it? Well worth exploring.
15 love.
Yep.
Yeah,
At the moment,
But water would still have to go to a use to provide for some economic or social outcome.
But that's the value of the iwi management plan. That's where that would be articulated, and then you could test the application against those provisions and say, yes, this does meet the needs or the the result that we're looking for.
But I just want to say, it is a bit of a fob, really, because this... why would Tangata Whenua want this water in the middle of winter except to store it? I mean, no marae wants water in the middle of winter. They've got far too much. They want to get rid of it. It's just not. It is a fob. So, to cut to the chase here, we need 5 million cubes of water to deal with this plan, which is, why wouldn't we, and I just want to correct Tania, there is no view that anyone wants to build a dam on the Nararora. And actually, that's the plan says you can't. But there is a lot of talk around building a water storage around off the Nararora, which does 20 million cubes. Why wouldn't, as a community, we just go for that and future-proof ourselves for the next 30, 50 years. I mean, you wouldn't build you just build it, that's the logical place. I've been up and visited it. And if you wanted to augment the Nararora, but for 20 million, you can do.
Yeah, but there's only 17 million available.
But well, yeah, that's just nonsense.
Well, if we bought,
You know, did you see the Karamu last week?
So Peter's comment about the challenging the science is not acceptable, whereas yours challenging the science, which we've been told is 17 million, is acceptable.
So just to be clear, there's lots more water, but the science is saying if you take more than that, you're starting to have an ecological effect that the tank group thought was unacceptable.
Yeah.
So we actually have quite a constrained framework in this policy to protect the environment in terms of taking high flows.
Well, you know, but it would have been a jolly good thing to take quite a lot of water last week out of all of our creeks and streams. I just don't get the correlation between that. It take me a lot of, you know.
Can I just
throw
jump in
another-
here? Just in terms of this policy around 20%, I keep hearing how much of a gesture it was and how it was a bit random, no real analysis around it. I do not think that we should be just chucking it out there as is without some more robust support for it. So I welcome the gesture. I still think it's very, in the realms of possible, not likely or probable, we'll see. But I actually think we need to, if we as a committee are going to put this forward as part of this plan, then it needs to be backfilled with some robust support, because I don't want to put this out there, people look at it and think, oh, good on the RPC for doing this, and then it just gets shot down to pieces. So James, you've raised your concerns, Marianne, you think it can be sorted. I actually think we need something substantive to come to the committee which can actually support it going in there, and where it needs to be tweaked or detailed further, that should be done. But at the moment, I think we're batting around something that doesn't have a lot of substance behind it, and it needs more substance.
Is that possible?
I don't think it's possible.
There is.
I guess I come to the opposite conclusion, which is that we should just take it off the table. James laid out, there's a dynamic process nationally going on that affects these rights in more fundamental ways even, and we're wading into this prematurely, it seems to me, and just inviting a lot of controversy around a provision like this. If we put it in something that goes to public notification, it seems to me this belongs in the next 10-year plan.
No, because by that time the allocations may all be gone.
yeah, and you know.
So we're just putting a marker in the sand at the end of the day.
It's a plan's a plan.
Well, then let's not waste a lot of time pretending we're doing analysis of it. Let's just, take the arbitrary 20% and put it in the plan and move on to more fundamental issues.
Well, can we just hear from staff, though, about the feasibility of even a little robustness around that? Can you help us out there, Mary?
Well, we have got some provision for legal review of parts of the plan, and this would be one of the parts that we could get some legal review on.
So you're saying physical quantity, you want better justified.
Yeah, not illegal.
Not the legal.
Not legal.
Well, the volume, as the chair has pointed out, is probably reasonable, but I'm more interested to know whether it's possible legally, because it remains an opportunity. As Tony has said, it's a possibility. And why wouldn't we put it out there and say, and particularly if government are talking about potential funding for tangata whenua, I mean, if tangata whenua were short to grabbing this and saying, yeah, we'll have a piece of that, at least have it on the table, because it does represent possibility and potential. Why wouldn't you?
I'm with Neil on this, but for similar but different reasons, I'll articulate them differently. I don't think this is a legal argument. This is basically a political decision. Let's be frank about it. This is politics. And it's not legal, there's nothing legal to it. We don't have to have a legal thing. We can do it for political decisions. Second point is, I'm not particularly worried about a coherent, structured, powerful, compelling argument beneath it. I'm quite happy with it just because we think it's the right thing to do. And the second thing is, do I think this will be the end of the conversation? No, I don't. So I see this as being on the start of the board and moving forward. You know, what the hell? Make a start and let's see where it goes to. I think the old story, nothing ventured, nothing gained. We can say nothing, take it off the table and be perfectly safe. Easy position. I'd much rather put it on the deck and then let's see where it takes us to.
Yeah, but I get what Tani is saying. You go out to the Marais with us, and there's some crafty old buggers out there, and they'll say, so what you're doing is you're giving us 20% of God's water, which just plonks down on the plain somewhere, and we've got to store it, because that's all they can do with it, store it. So it is, what is it?
Well, I would have had a different spin on it. If we bought properties all along the Hiratonga Plains and we bought the water takes with it, would it include 20% on top of that?
No, you have to store it, that's the point.
Well, and we would. But what I'm saying is, if we bought land and the water takes with it along the Hiratonga Plains, and then we have this 20% allocation that we have available for us to use it, which would then redirect and give possible opportunities of different ways of managing that land.
Absolutely.
So it's how you view it. It's not on the current status, absolutely not. It's how you would broker and utilise that or optimise it for the future.
You're quite right.
But you have to store it, put up a capital to store
Of course you do.
Of course you do.
So storage is a water tank outside of Marae, just pump it out of the river.
A lot of them.
Yeah, a lot of it.
And actually, part of settlement is it's the sum as well as the parts. So we've got the Marae and the settlement group. So however we want to look at it, you know, it's how do we optimise the current things on the table.
Well, if you're happy to leave it in, I'm happy to leave it in. You want to leave it in?
The Chairman,
Fine with it.
we need to go and have a discussion with some private people.
Well, I think it should be left in, but I think as council we should be, I hear what Rick's saying. Yes, it's a political decision, but nonetheless, the plans we put up have to be defensible. So let's do a little bit, you know, let's get some work done to make it more defensible. Otherwise, this conversation's a waste of time.
Just Tom's point.
No, Tom's point is take it off the table. My point is leave it in and let's make it defensible. I've got to go shortly to pick up some small people, but I wondered if I had a question about Policy 38 around this whole investigating water storage in relation to Ngāruroro. I just wanted to understand in terms of the way this plan is drafted and policies such as this, am I right? Oh, actually, where is the policy relating to that? Because I'm actually looking at a paragraph.
Yes.
I'm looking at the paper that we were given on the 14th of August, which sets out the draft tank plan change. And in paragraph 38 there, I just want to understand, so in terms of a policy, what we're saying here is that we're going to investigate something, and I'm trying to understand why that's a policy. That's just an action.
But it is an action. It's a process policy that commits the council to, perhaps would have been more correct to talk about to mitigate or offset or remedy somehow the adverse effects of groundwater take. So maybe the wording was a little bit unfortunate to start with, to investigate, but certainly the aim is to remedy or mitigate an adverse effect through the development of a water storage project, if that proves to be feasible.
That's an action, is the point that she's making.
Yeah. So my concern here is I thought these would actually be things that we are implementing, we're going to do. This signals to me something we're thinking about, and I wouldn't have thought that was an appropriate policy. I'm not saying that I disagree that it should be done. I'm just saying, why is it in the plan as a policy? Because it's not a policy.
As I said, I think it could be worded as a policy because the policy is around mitigating the adverse effects of the stream depletion on the Ngāruroro. So that is the policy is to address that. And the way we're going to address it is through this mitigation measure. But, yeah.
Well, another question to that is, if we were going to investigate that, why wouldn't we investigate avoiding the negative effects of pumping, for example? Because here we're just mitigating.
Well, the reason you wouldn't do that, because if you're going to mitigate the evil effects of pumping, you'd have to stop it. It's the only way to mitigate it. Avoid it.
You mean avoid?
Yeah, avoid it. It's just to not pump. If you're not pumping, well then,
Not growing.
they'll grow.
No taxes.
But the way it's worded is there's actually no looking at avoiding pumping. It's, pumping is a given. And if we're only investigating, why can't we investigate how you might avoid, remedy or mitigate?
Well, that's the point of the policy. It's saying we're taking a choice to remedy or mitigate. The choice has not been to avoid, which would result in a different action. So the choice has been to look at mitigating. Therefore, we do need that policy to show how the adverse effects are being managed.
And it's also, sorry Tanya, Tom here, it's also in conjunction with a range of other policies which say things like, well, you don't get to pump like you're pumping now. There's a, your allocation is reduced to actual and reasonable use and, according to efficiency standards. So it's not, there's nothing happening to the allocation or how people have been asked to use their water.
So you've got exactly the same thing with the proposal for augmentation. It's a proposal to look at the feasibility rather than a policy, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So maybe that should be in a different document, but like the implementation plan has some things that we plan to do. I'm trying to understand how these things make it into a plan as if it were a policy versus an action.
Fair to say it's stronger in here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Fair to say it's stronger in here, but...
Is there any technical issue with it being described as a policy or not?
I think having it in here as a policy gives it more strength and more clarity around how the council is managing adverse effects. And it's acknowledging that, well, we haven't really got all the answers yet, but this is the pathway we're going to investigate.
Yep.
So I would,
It's the nature of policies generally in the RMA beyond this plan and others. They do contain, if you like, directions of travel as opposed to definitive actions.
Does it state intent?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what it's doing is demonstrating or articulating intent, which is part and parcel in our RMA process, I would have thought.
Well, I think we just need to be clear about this because we're going to have a discussion at a later time about the implementation plan. And there are some matters that Tangata Whenua have been raising and are concerned about that are relegated to the implementation plan, but they don't appear in here in the policy section, in this part of our draft plan, where if we're actually saying this is a serious commitment to do this, then we should be asking ourselves why some things that are essentially action points are making it into the plan versus other things only making it into the implementation plan. What's the distinction?
the implementation plan also reflects how the policies are going to be implemented. So I'm not quite sure which bits of the implementation plan that there are issues with. It would be good to get that in more detail so that we can maybe look at it.
I've got memory around tangata whenua and monitoring, for example.
And it's about confidence that mitigation will occur. So if you make a discerning decision that it's going to be a policy in here, and you're right, Marianne, you can tighten the wording up, or it's going to be an implementation. It is about giving confidence to tangata whenua that the mitigation is going to occur and in a way that's conducive to the desired results of the whenua.
So make it policy.
Yeah.
So
it needs to be tighter.
Possibly. There was some questions around Mataranga Māori and monitoring and kaitiakitanga. there are quite a few places where it is mentioned, and it starts at issue number 7. We talk about information gaps, and I have to say we did have an initial comment in there to say that we have got information gaps arising through the more global, hang on, I'll just, from the adoption
What page are you on, Marianne?
Well, I'm actually referring to issue number 7, which is in the draft plan change.
What page is that?
That would be page
14?
Page 4.
14, is it?
If we're looking at the agenda version, page 7.
Page 7.
Or page 6 of the plan itself. So we did originally suggest that some of the information gaps result from the adoption of the tangata whenua worldview that accounts for the spiritual and tikanga Māori values, as well as the tangible aspects of resource management, which is where we've come from. But on the advice of the treaty partners, that sentence was taken out. But the issue is still relevant, that there are unknowns, and I'd be happy to put that sentence back in to make it clear that one of the issues is this lack of information around how we account for the tangata whenua worldview. But then we also are aware of other work that will influence how we go into the future around Mataranga Māori. And part of it is what the council itself is doing. So we have quite a big project in the Tuki Tuki that is looking at precisely how we do Mataranga Māori. So we're working with Mana Whenua in that space currently. That will inform how we can do give effect to Mataranga Māori monitoring in Tank as well. We will learn from that project.
So would then that be that policy would be in the plan change reflecting that, and then in the implementation it would be how you would give effect to it?
It's already been done.
in the plan, Marianne? Because the passages you're referring to, my understanding, this preamble, doesn't it all fall away?
It does, but it's the first acknowledgement that there's an issue around information gaps. So to be complete, it should really be contained in that issue statement so that it leads on to some of the other aspects. So the Tuki plan change isn't mentioned in this plan because it's already happening. We don't really need to provide for it because it's already there and happening. There's also a lot of work at a national level that can feed into better understanding. The objectives do specifically refer to kaitiakitanga, so it's kind of permeated through the language. And Schedule 1 specifically includes a statement, a placeholder for Mataranga Māori attributes. We didn't have any, but we've clearly identified a gap that needs to be filled in the next iteration of the plan change.
That's 10 years' time. Why do we not have that now?
Well, it is there now. I mean, there's a gap. What do we put in that Schedule 1? We didn't have the information that let us fill those details. So
I'm asking why we don't have that information, because that's a serious gap.
So that will be addressed through some of the work that is happening as a result of the Tuki plan implementation work. And it relies on input by the Mana Whenua to help work out what does this look like in a RMA plan.
So the Tuki attributes, etc., that work Mātauranga Māori is not necessarily going to apply across the whole of all these catchments, because you're talking about different peoples.
That's right, but it provides the beginning of understanding how it should look and what frameworks we should be using.
The reason I broached it was because we need to look at the plan change in a way that how does it give confidence to Mana Whenua? And those gaps would not lend itself to giving confidence to Mana Whenua. And so to try and get some direction going forward, it's how do we embody within the Tank plan change and be able to discern in the implementation plan in such a way that it would give confidence that mitigation processes, as opposed to waiting till the end of the 10 years, they can see the journey of the mitigation and process. And if you want to look at principles, I'm looking at page 17 of the RRMP, and it's got iwi environmental management principles, and how you give effect to it. And it's a good place to start, that's all I'm saying.
So I could say, but wait, there's more, in that the plan actually does refer to Mataranga Māori and monitoring and Māori tools and approaches as part of the policy around assisting with monitoring the effectiveness of the plan and the rules and the policies in it. So the council it has that commitment. So I think that's the connection with the implementation plan. We're monitoring and reporting on the state of riparian land and wetlands. We're carrying out regular ecosystem habitat assessments, including through the application of Mataranga Māori tools and approaches. So if we need to build on that particular policy, then we need to hear how we can fix that to address your concerns. But that's where it is currently.
Could I just make the observation? Seems to me that when we're at the workshop, we're here not to write the end result. We're here to have the issues discussed. The issue's been raised. I think it's well articulated. I sense from your discussion, Marianne, you've apprehended it. So at some later stage, when we come to the plan, you've either got to have redrafted it so it's clearer, or if it's in there clearer, we have to come back and explain it how it is there. Because that seems to me that we can go around this another 3 or 4 loops and we won't get any further ahead.
Well, I'm looking for what else needs to go in here.
I know, but I'm just yes.
Yeah.
So the action point we need is there something that Tangata Whenua see in the implementation plan which they believe should be in the policy? So how do we get that direction of travel? So how do we transact that? How do we find?
So for me, this would hopefully come to us getting together with Tangata Whenua's technical advisors. We've captured the issue and the action up there.
Yep.
Oh, that's good.
And
so that's the action point.
Yeah.
So we've got the issue. Someone will come back and say, discussed it, heard it, here's the answer. Bill will say, yes, I agree with that, tick, or need an improvement here, do that. Yep. I think we're done, Chair.
Well, you clearly have done your bags packed.
I know, Tanya's got her kids. I don't want the kids be wandering up and down the street and people looking to...
Homeless.
Wreaking havoc. Thank you, everyone. Sorry I have to go.
Cheers.
Is everyone happy that we're done, or is everyone just happy that they are done?
I'm happy that I'm done.
And then we probably...
I've been in this building since 9 o'clock this morning.
Oh, no, you're
Held captive by Neil
yes.
for a period of time.
For far too long. God, he's doing shags around.
Best 5 hours of your life.
Then we'll call this meeting to a halt. Thank you, everyone, for your patience today.
Thank you, Chair.
Do you want to close our meeting? I think.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa inoi tātou. Kia tātou katoa, tia te whai o tātou āriki mihi o kareiti, me te arawa o te atua, me te whiwhinga, ki tahutanga, ki te wairua tapu, ake. Amen. Bless you all as you journey home. Ka kite.
Thank you.
Get out of my building.
Thanks, Ezra.